Hello to those who have joined us already. We're really glad that you're here for our tracking webinar this afternoon. So my name is Catherine. I am an AmeriCorps member serving with the Vermont Land Trust, and I'm kind of been helping get the virtual events, together and facilitated. And I have today, we have Chris Bernier from Vermont Fish and Wildlife. He's a wildlife biologist. And then we have Peter Van Loan, whose last name I just said correctly for the first time. And he is a forester at VLT. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like for the southeast or the south part of the state, southern part of the state.
Yeah, I cover the southern four counties.
Yes, so we have two experts today. Well, I guess if you want to consider yourself a tracking, okay. We have one expert and one, I don't know what the in-between is of expert and beginner, but two enthusiastic animal trackers here with us to teach us more about finding tracks in the winter, even if it feels like spring outside. So we can go ahead and talk about some Zoom logistics. So if you're using a computer, you'll find these controls at the bottom of your screen, but you might have to look around for them in other places if you're using, an iPad or a phone. But you can put your comments in the chat function, which you'll find on the bottom left hand of the screen. And then for questions, please put those in the Q&A, which says Q&A. It's on the right hand bottom corner of the screen, and it has two little chat bubbles instead of one, and that helps us keep track of questions more easily. And we will have time for Q&A at the end of this webinar. Just a reminder, we cannot see or hear you, the attendees. Your camera and mics are off, just for some peace of mind at home. And if you have any questions, you can send me a direct message during the webinar, for some tech support or troubleshooting. And I think that's everything. And also a recording of this will be put on our YouTube page probably by tomorrow afternoon if you want to share it or watch it again. So we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, great. Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everybody. Thanks for spending a little time with us today, talking about winter wildlife tracking. So one of the things we know from surveys of past webinar attendees is that a lot of you are coming to us because of communication directly from VLT. So I don't have to spend a lot of time talking to you about our work. Probably you already know that. You know that we work with landowners and communities to protect land that's important to them for the values that are important to them. And we know that there are certain benefits that accrue to us beyond just protecting value or protecting land from development when we do conservation projects. When we conserve forest land, those woods are available for management in the future, and they'll help support the forest products industry in Vermont. But at the same time, those forests will be filtering the water that runs through it, and they'll be available for outdoor recreation. And they'll be, sorry about that, I need to mute my phone. They will be drawing in and storing a tremendous amount of carbon for us. And of course, they'll also be protecting the wildlife habitat that's there. And some of our projects are done specifically for really important wildlife habitat. We've done a lot of work in Arlington. There's a critical bear corridor that goes from the Taconics across to the Green Mountains. This slide you see in front of you now is from a webinar we did last fall. Again, it was a partnership with Fish and Wildlife. Kim Royer talked about wildlife corridors, and Bob Heiser talked about the Shutesville Hill wildlife corridor that he's working to protect up in the Stowe and Waterbury area. So if you want to look at that at some point, it's on our YouTube channel. But as exciting as all this work is, it's kind of hard sometimes to connect to it. We're sort of even me, I work for the Vermont Land Trust and still a little removed from the work. So today, one of our goals today is to help you connect to the work and connect to the animals who benefit from the work that we do. Last year, we did this event in person. It was just before all the COVID shutdowns. It was in January, and we did it on Chris's property in partnership with the Grafton Nature Center. And it was really fun. It was, made everything really tangible and alive. Obviously, we can't do that today in this virtual setting, but Chris has got a really engaging presentation for you, and he's going to provide you with some resources. He's going to provide you with a new way to think about and approach tracking, and he's going to help you think about areas to look for wildlife tracks, and then we are going to present some ideas about where in the state you could go to explore some conserved lands and help connect you to the outside, to the woods, to the work, and to the wildlife. So with that, I want to turn it over to Chris with my heartfelt thanks for the tremendous amount of work that he put into doing this presentation. I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks, Chris.
Well, thank you, Peter. I couldn't be happier, honestly, to be doing this. This is a passion for me, and I love sharing it. And in our previous collaboration here last year really drove that home for me, and just how much people love wildlife tracking and the mysteries of our forest and the animals in it. So thank you for making this possible, Peter, and for bringing this forward today. So it is a beautiful day, and I know it's kind of hard to be in front of Zoom again, especially on this first really beautiful, almost spring-like day. But rest assured, this is not great tracking conditions. If anyone was itching to get out right now, it's probably not the best of tracking conditions. So it's a good time for us to get up to speed on tracking, and then hopefully our conditions will firm up a little bit overnight maybe, and you can get out at it soon. So when Peter first approached me this past fall about the idea of doing this virtually, I was very excited. I thought it would be a great idea. I had grand visions of, well, we could do this and this. Well, I've embedded videos of me out in the woods following tracks. And but as pen was put to paper, as you say, it became readily apparent that, wow, there's a lot to cover. And this is a challenging venue to do it. So that I had to really scale back my thinking a little bit and to get it to a more reasonable amount of information to present. And which has actually turned out to be really good, because it got me more focused on two primary objectives, which may have been lost otherwise. And so my first objective, which is kind of an obvious one, is to basically have you all leave here with additional tools, additional knowledge, additional resources that maybe you hadn't had before or hadn't thought about before, and a roadmap for how to think about wildlife tracking and a process of how you get to the end game of what animal is it. So that's really the bulk of the presentation, but woven through it is an enthusiasm for getting outside. That's my second objective. I really, really want to have people leave this presentation feeling invigorated to go explore their backyards, their neighborhoods, their local public lands, conserved lands, whatever the case might be. And that's in recognition of the fact that people who engage in the outdoors, wildlife related or otherwise even, but people who spend time in the outdoors with their pursuits, whatever they may be, are people who grow to know and understand wildlife better, the habitats, the comings and goings of the annual cycle, and they become the stewards of these resources, our habitat, our land, and our animals that rely on it. So that's really my goal, is to light a fire under you all to get you out there ASAP, engaging with wildlife in your backyards and beyond. So with that, we need to first establish, is wildlife tracking an art or a science? And the answer is, of course, as you all know, it's both. In my role as a wildlife biologist with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, I play the scientist role probably more than I'd like to sometimes even. But when I'm trying to discern whether this is a Canada lynx track or a bobcat or a mink from an American marten, the marten and the lynx, of course, being endangered species or listed species, I have to be certain. I have to employ the science. I have to have the tape measure, the guides, and all of the accoutrements to be able to confidently identify those. So that's the science part. But in my personal life, I actually am more of an artist when it comes to tracking. I often don't come to the conclusion as to what that animal is. I enjoy the mystery. I enjoy the process of learning about it, following it, just enjoying the beauty of the sign that it left behind. And that, in my mind, is more of an artistic approach. Often I can figure it out, but I enjoy the mystery probably more than anything. And I'll just say, before moving into the meat of the presentation, that nothing that I can provide in the next 40 minutes or so is going to prepare you to become as fruitful a tracker as you wish than being outside and actually putting time in the outdoors, following animal sign around. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where you gain the skills and the knowledge necessary. I'm just hoping to provide a little bit of a kick to get you out the door. So we'll start with just a few resources. And to be clear, what I'm going to show in this and the next slide are just a handful of some of the resources that are available to people. These happen to be resources that I have used and relied on, both for my work and with my family for the artistic side of tracking. This book here in the right-hand side, I believe it's a Sue Morse just recently published it. I think it just became available for sale. And I have not, honestly, haven't had a chance to read through it, but I guarantee you that it's packed full of incredible information of local animals, their natural history, and tips on tracking. Paul Rosenda's book here on the left has been around for quite a while, and this has been a go-to for myself and for a number in the office. And it just provides a really concise, clear description of animal track and sign, and it's very comprehensive. These two up here on the top together were produced by Lynn Levine, a local forester, and I really turned to them quite a bit because they provide just such a great basic synopsis of the tracks. There's not a lot of other information regarding natural history and things like that, but it's a really great logical grouping of tracks in a logical way to try to figure out what it is. And honestly, what I'm presenting here today is kind of based on the method that she points out here. And then there's these two. For those that aren't familiar with Northern Woodlands, it's a quarterly publication. And in addition to just keeping you informed on the health and management of our northern forests, which we all enjoy, it's a great resource for the comings and goings of wildlife. There are two columns in particular that I enjoy. One is the seasonal notes that's written by Elise Tillinghast, I think is who writes it. Excuse me. And that's basically a calendar of events to look for, not just about tracks, but about sign and even what flowers may be coming into bloom for those months and things like that. But it's a really great synopsis of the months that are covered by that particularly quarterly publication. There's also a regular piece in it from Sue Morse, tracking tips, and it's often the first place that I go to get the tips of the quarter, if you will. It's a great piece. And here on the right is a book by another local naturalist, Mary Holland, and she has a blog, the Naturally Curious blog. And if you're not familiar with it, it's an awesome blog. And why I like the blog and this accompanying book is that it provides a month-to-month journey, as the title here says, through the fields, woods, and marshes of New England. It really is a great place to go, not only to figure out what it is you saw in the woods, but also to give you targets for trying to find. So to give you ideas for things to go to look for. So enough of the resources there. We'll jump right into some of the tracking, the nitty gritty. And this is the roadmap that I'm presenting here. It's really a three-part roadmap, and it's just a way of thinking, and it's a way of training your mind to approach tracking when you get into it. So there are three things that you're going to be looking for. The first is the pattern. and all wildlife. And I should say, before I go much further here, that I'm going to be focusing primarily on four-legged wildlife. So I'm not going to be doing anything with birds, although I did have a bird section in it, but it became too lengthy. And there's a whole other world of bird exploration for sign in the winter. But suffice it to say, we're talking about four-legged animals here today. And there are four distinct groups based on their primary mode of mobility, how they get around. And we're going to go through each of those groups. So pattern first, followed by behavior. So you're looking for those little clues in their behavior and following the track that might give way to what they are. And then last is the habitat that they're in. And when you follow this roadmap, pattern, behavior, habitat, more often than not, you can get to the answer. Sometimes you may be able to narrow it down to one or two animals based on the track quality and how long you're able to follow a track, but it'll get you close, if not all the way. So we're going to go through each of the four patterns, starting with the hoppers, which are my favorite group. And I'll say right up front, they're my favorite group because they are so accessible to us and they're readily observable. Many of them are active during the day. They're frequent visitors to our backyard or the back woodlot. So they're accessible to us. And also they're just crazy bonkers. They leave so much sign all over the place as if they have nothing better to do all day than just hop, hop, hop. They are crazy lot of species. And they're made up of the squirrels, chipmunks, the lagomorphs, the rabbit and the hares, and a good number of mice fall into that category as well. And I'll also say that I'm not going to focus much on the mice because they're really a group that I'm not particularly strong with, but I challenge you all to get yourselves up to speed on the various mouse species that are out there and the winter sign that they leave. Because again, they're very accessible to us all around us, probably even a little more accessible than you'd like at times. So the one commonality of this group is that they all have larger hind feet than their front feet. They have really strong back legs, and their back legs are the principal means of their mobility. So when you look at the individual track patterns of them, this is essentially what the hoppers leave. And they're really consistent. They're probably the most consistent group as far as the type of patterns that they leave. And I didn't label these inadvertently, I meant to. This here in the upper left is a snowshoe hare. And you can see it has the larger front feet forward of the two trailing, I don't know if I said that right, the larger hind feet forward of the trailing front feet. So the direction of movement in this animal, as well as the others, is toward the top of the page, or top of the slide. And that is the typical, all four prints, each individual paw. It's called a double register. They're all there. There are a couple variations that you will see up here in the upper right. This is an animal that is sitting. It's not moving. And so its hind feet, larger hind feet, are actually behind the front feet. That's pretty common to see as well. That's just sitting there. And then you also see here in the lower right, in deeper snow, where they all 4 feet register in what appears to be just 2 prints. And this can be quite challenging to discern from other groups of animals, notably the mustelids, the weasels, the bounders, as we'll talk about in a minute. But just know that when you see this pattern, that the 2 tracks are side by side. They're parallel to each other almost perfectly, whereas with the bounders, they're slightly askew in a diagonal fashion, and that'll give it away. The last thing I say here is the way they move is they leap off with their hind feet, again, strong legs, and they then up in the air, and they come down first with their front feet, sometimes one ahead of the other. Then their back feet then swing forward of their planted front feet to plant ahead of them, if that makes any sense. So they spring off with their back feet, they then land on their front feet, and then their back feet follow forward of their front feet so that their front legs are basically between their two hind legs, and then they repeat it. It's a very unique hop. And so when you get into discerning one from the other, it's really all about size. And I don't have a cottontail rabbit in the slide just because there was too much to put in one slide. But from left to right, you're looking at sizes. So you have the snowshoe hare being the largest of the hoppers, followed by cottontail rabbit, not in here, gray squirrel down to red squirrel. And again, I'm not really spending any time with mice, but then there's the whole slew of mice, which also have this same pattern, but are much smaller. So the other thing, again, pattern, behavior, habitat. So when you're out there and you're scratching your head and you're not sure what it is you're looking at, is it a gray squirrel or is it a rabbit? And they can be confusing. You start to look at the behavior that you're seeing. And so have you noticed any browsing? Like in this upper left-hand corner, you can see this is perfectly nipped off at a 45-degree angle. That's characteristic of a snowshoe hare. So if you see that, you know you've got a hare. Or if the tracks like these two here lead to a tree and disappear up the tree, you know you're dealing with a squirrel of one type or other. Also, middens. That's a place where squirrels will rest and eat their cones, and they shred their cone from top to bottom and expose the seeds, and they leave all the little individual petals of the cone in one big heap, a midden. If you see that, you're reasonably assured that it's a red squirrel. And another thing that I find confusing sometimes are the trails that certain species in the hoppers, notably the snowshoe hare and red squirrels even to some degree, will use the same runway, I call it, through the habitat to the point where it obscures all their tracks, their individual tracks. And it becomes a real challenge to discern what it is. But just know that the red squirrels and definitely snowshoe hare do that a lot. And if you look around, you'll find a track set off to the side that'll give way to what they are. And then, you know, the behavior and the habitat component of this presentation by nature of necessity have to be general because we're talking about groups of animals. And so I'm generally going to be presenting, you know, the habitat types that you want to look for. But what I'm hoping is that it plants the seed in your head that, all right, if I want to find these animals or this animal, I need to know its habitat, and then I'm going to go into that habitat. So for example, here at the Windsor Grasslands Wildlife Management Area in Windsor, where I've never seen a cottontail rabbit track, to be clear, but it's really got a lot of great habitat, what I would consider to be for cottontail rabbit. Scrub, shrub, kind of wetland, fallow field in places. It's just a real tangle. Hedgerows, cottontail rabbit, love that. I've not seen them there. I don't know that they're there one way or the other, but I have not seen them there. Here at Densmore Hill, WMA, is an early successional forest management practice, a young forest where it had been patch cut and now it's growing up. This looks to be somewhere in the ballpark of 10 years old, maybe a little more. That's a great spot to find snowshoe hare. If you've got a sizable quantity of this type of habitat, young forest habitat, almost guaranteed you're going to find snowshoe hare sign in it. And it's really fun to poke your way through that habitat looking for additional sign of their activity. With the squirrels, just know that there's a lot of overlap between gray and red squirrels or where they exist, notably in your backyard for one, but even out in the woods, they do overlap. But in their core, red squirrels are primarily a conifer forest species, a softwood species, and gray squirrels tend to stay with the hardwoods. Again, they do cross. And if you study an animal in its core habitat and its tracks and its behavior, it helps you when you're in that mixing zone where it's mixing with other species that have similar tracks to be able to discern what it is. So the next group, the bounders, which I know I said the hoppers were my favorite, and I apologize. The bounders are actually my favorite group. They are really the cool animals. They will take you into some of the most interesting habitats, and you know, they're just so intense. You know, when you follow a bounder track, they're just on a mission all the time, and they will weasel their way into whatever nook and cranny they can get into in search of food. And they also seem to have fun doing it. Really cool group of animals. And so to be clear, we're talking about the bounders, and they are weasels, the mustelid family primarily. And what holds them all together is that they all have long, narrow bodies with very short legs. And that combination forces them to move in a particular pattern, which we'll talk about here in a second. But first, they're all plantigrade, which means, like humans, they walk on their heels. And so being a plantigrade animal leaves a very distinct print, almost human-like in some ways. And also they have 5 toes that register in their print. So you can see that here with the otter and the fisher across the top, and then the mink, which is noteworthy of saying that that mink is zoomed in quite a ways. That's a small track. Their primary pattern is this here that you see. It's the 2x2. And so what they do is they crouch down, almost like a hopper in some way. They crouch down and spring forward like an accordion spring. And then they land with their front feet first, like the hopper. But as their back feet are coming down, their front feet lift off and their back feet land exactly where their front feet were just registering. So this is what we call a direct register track. So the front feet hit the ground first and leave a print, and then the back feet land directly on top of them and cover up the front foot tracks. So this is the track that is kind of the characteristic bounder pattern. They all will do this at some point. There's some variation, and we're going to go through some of that in a little bit. But if you follow a track that you're scratching your head on, not sure, and it turns into doing this, then you've probably got a bounder. I will say that the weasels, long tail and short tail both, tend, and that's the picture here on the right is a weasel. The picture on the left is a fisher. The weasels don't vary much from this unless they're in a really thick tangle and they're more creeping around. But when they're moving across the snow, this is their pattern, and they can jump a long distance between, their stride is really a long way, longer than you would think possible. So some of the variations that you'll see with the bounders that will cause confusion, and I find this to be more so for fisher and to some degree even mink. Marten, you don't encounter their tracks very often because there's only 2 small populations in the state. So unless you're in those areas, you won't encounter marten tracks really, or unlikely to. But those 3 will kind of vary quite a bit, fisher most notably. And so what you have here on the left, well, actually all of these are variations of a lope. And they will be patterns of 4 or 3. Like you see here, these perfectly diagonal. This is one fisher moving toward the top of the photo, and this is another fisher days later also moving to the top of the photo. This appears to be a female based on the size. They're smaller, and this appears to be a male. It's a much larger fisher, but these are both lopes. This is a slow lope. This is a fast lope, maybe even a trot or even moving toward a gallop. But you end up with these patterns of 3 or 4, and how you distinguish them from other of the groups of patterns we're going to talk about is that they're really tight, they're clustered. So this is a tight cluster of tracks followed by another tight cluster of tracks, so on and so forth. And another clue for determining which it is, and I should say right off the bat that there's a lot of overlap here and they can be a real challenge to discern one from the other. But you look at the size, at first glance, it's all size. So the weasels are the smallest. The mink and the marten are virtually the same in the middle. The fisher are notably large. In fact, a large male fisher can be strikingly large, larger than you would think. And then, of course, otter, which are even larger. And I don't have a picture here for it, but they're even larger. And so some behaviors to look for, and again, this is where the fun part of it, the artistic part comes in. If you happen to be in a wetland habitat or along a riverbank or stream and you cross some tracks that you're not sure what they are, maybe you've narrowed it down to a bounder based on the pattern, but the snow quality is such that you can't discern the individual track, details to tell that it's this or that, follow it. And if it gives way to some sort of slide like this, well, then you're certain that you've got an otter in your hand. And I will say that otter tend to do this for fun. And it is also fun for us to see that and to follow it. and to enjoy. I mean, you can interpret it in the snow. Like, what are they doing? There doesn't appear to be any other reason beyond just sliding around and having fun. It's worth noting that I have seen both fisher and mink slide as well. Mink more frequently than fisher. Mink is generally actually mink and fish are generally in deep snow on a hillside. They'll stop their gait, their normal walk or lope, and then they'll just slide a short distance. You do see that occasionally, and it can throw you. Some of the other behaviors, and again, I'm speaking broadly. I'm trying to give you a roadmap of a way to approach things. So there are many more behaviors to explore. We only have a short time today to explore a few, but this track on the left is a marten track that was one that I followed actually just 2 weeks ago, I think, in the Green Mountain National Forest. And I was struggling, was it a mink or is it a marten? Well, lo and behold, this track, which was a little older, so it's hard to follow, but it disappeared into this tangle of brush. And you can't see it in the picture, but there was a big blowdown and a root wad in here and a log that went away from the photo behind this mess that you can't see. And this marten track disappeared into that. And I never found where it came up. And that's typical of a marten. They spend a lot of time under the snow in what we call a subnivean environment, hunting redback voles through the winter. So that gave it away to me. I was like, that's definitely a marten. And I felt pretty secure with that. But here you can see a mink that drops into the water unceremoniously, cold or warm, whatever. They just drop in and go, and you lose the track. That's a pretty clear indicator of a mink. Where I will say you see a lot of mink track along the bank of a stream or a river, and they just seem to bounce around right at that zone between water and the snow. And they dip into the water at times and dip back up onto the snow. And they're fun to watch and try to figure out what they're doing. And this here in the upper right, my son and I, a couple of weeks ago, followed a fisher track. We knew it was a fisher track, but we were following it for the fun of it to see what story it would tell. And it brought us right to this porcupine den. It didn't appear that it actually successfully came away with the porcupine meal, but they do. Fish are one of the only animals that will actively pursue porcupines. But again, behavior, follow it, see what it's doing. If you're struggling with it, is it a fisher or is it a mink or what? Follow it, and then you get some clues. And last on the bounders is just a note on habitat. And again, as a group, you can find them anywhere across the state, but individually, there's some things that they focus on. And I would say for mink, marten, weasel to some extent, and fisher, it's all about structure. Well, mink is a lot about water, but you'll find them in the uplands too. Don't be fooled by that. They do spend a lot of time even climbing trees, but they all love structure, whether it's stone walls, brush piles. Really, weasels love that stuff. You'll find tracks there religiously, but blowdowns, tangled messes, they just have to explore that structure. And of course, for otter, you're going to be looking at beaver flowages, wetlands, rivers, riparian habitat. Those are the places that you want to explore. Moving on to waddlers, which, okay, all right, so maybe they're not my favorite. Well, they are. They're actually, this is probably my favorite group. I mean, really, this is the most diverse group, made up of a cast of characters that you either love them or you hate them. But together, you gotta love them. They are just awesome. And what I find so pleasing about them is that they never seem to be in a hurry. They're not like those jacked up hoppers that just bounce around all day. They don't have the intensity of the bounders. They just seem to kind of lull their way through the day, doing their thing. They never seem to be in a hurry. Obviously, there's sometimes some exceptions, but generally speaking, they're just out doing their thing. And I love them for that. So you're talking about a diverse group: bear, porcupine, beaver, raccoon, skunk, opossums, muskrat. And where they're all common is that they have heavy bodies with relatively short legs. And their back legs are typically longer than their front. And that combination of features really sets up a unique gait called the waddle. Before we look at their gait, just another note about their actual print. So they are also plantigrade. So they leave a heel print, and pretty obvious heel print at that. So they can be mistook for mustelids, which also have that plantigrade pattern. But when you look at their actual pattern, they're very different from mustelids, or from the bounders, I should say. And it's really hard to explain how they do this. But essentially think of them swinging their weight from one side to the other. You can picture it, it's a waddle. And then they move both legs, front and back, simultaneous on one side, put it down, and then switch their weight to the other side and move their legs on the other side forward. And it really sets up a very unique and pretty consistent pattern of a waddle. And it's a direct register pattern, so it means that both their front and back feet are going to show in their tracks. Not always, depending on the conditions and their speed of movement. Sometimes those front and hind tracks move together and they become direct register, and that can be a little confusing. But if you follow it long enough, you'll see this gait. The one notable exception for the waddlers that doesn't have the same sort of pattern is the raccoon. And in fact, this is a unique pattern, all to raccoon. And this is a great picture of it. It really captures it perfect. So they are direct register. So you're seeing all four prints, hind, front. And then you see here, well, actually, I'm sorry, I misspoke. This is the hind foot, followed by the front foot. This is the hind foot, followed by the front foot. And you see how the angle changes, the diagonal angle changes from one direction to the other. And it does that over and over again. So it zigzags back and forth, back and forth. And the front foot, or the hind foot, depending on how you look at it, it flops back and forth from one side to the other as you follow it. Very unique. And, again, the raccoon handprint, if you call it that, their footprint is very, very discernible as well. So looking at their habitat, or actually their behaviors, I guess, first, again, just some small things to touch base on to get you thinking about other behaviors, because there is a plethora of waddler behavior that you can hone in on. But things like their browsing activities, like porcupines will denude trees in the forest, sometimes pretty extensively, both hard and softwood. You typically find them in somewhere near hemlock stands as well. And if you come across a hemlock with all these branches on the ground like that, sometimes that is actually by porcupines chewing the branches off, dropping them to the ground, and then they come down and eat on the branches. You'll also find waddlers up in the mast stands. Those are the stands that bear nuts, like beech nuts and acorns. And in the late fall, early winter, and in the late winter, early spring, when there are still some of this mass, some of the nuts on the ground, you'll find particularly bears snuffling around in the leaves looking for food. And then I put this picture of the bird feeder in just to basically symbolize all of the backyard behaviors that this suite of species is prone to. Investigating your chicken coop or feeding under the bird feeder. I mean, they're all, them, the cast of characters, the possum, the raccoon, the skunk. They live in and around us as a whole. They have adapted to our modified habitats very well, and are very readily visible with their whole suite of behaviors. Some a little frustrating, others not so. And to that note of like habitat, when we talk about bear, they're generally forest, not generally, they are forest species, but increasingly we're seeing them in parts of the state where they may not have had a heavy presence in the past, occasional certainly, but maybe not a heavy presence. But bear can be pretty much wherever, but you're reasonably assured to find sign of them when you get up into the forest, into those larger tracts, particularly the mass stands that we already talked about, like this bear-scarred beech tree. Good spot to find bears. Porcupines often are in areas where you find ledges like this, big rocky outcroppings, boulder fields, talus slopes. sometimes often in the older forests where trees have tipped up and you've got hollow logs on the ground, or even standing snags, big, even live trees, but standing and hollow, great places for porcupines to be found. Generally, the others, raccoon, possum, skunk, are really, you can find them anywhere. You don't find them so much in the higher elevations in the deep woods as much, but you do find them in the riparian corridors, in the valleys, in the areas where you've got active agriculture, fallow fields. You find them in areas where, even suburbia, where you have pockets of forest and other features like these river corridors. These are a cast of characters that have adapted well to the landscape of humans and can be found pretty much anywhere we exist. And the last group here is the walkers. And I will say right up front that this group is, I think, the most challenging to discern. And it's probably the group that people are most interested in discerning. It's the cast of characters are those with incredible charisma and cunning, and they have stealth and versatility, and they're kind of like the commanding group, right? The sentinels of the forest, if you will, and everyone wants to know what it is they've seen, and that's great. I share that, but they're a challenge, especially in tracking conditions which aren't perfect. But this group is essentially the canids and the felids. That's the dogs and the cats, the canines and the felines, and the hoofed animals, the ungulates, the deer and the moose. And they're, like I said already, they are very diverse and accessible because, as we'll talk about in a moment, they're everywhere as well. So what makes them unique is that they walk on their toes. They are perfect walkers, which I'll explain in a minute, but they only register 4 toes in their prints. And their front feet typically are distinctly larger than their rear feet, which is a little bit opposite of some of the other groups. Not a little, it's definitely opposite. And that's particularly true for the canids. Their front feet are much larger than their back feet. And a couple notes here about symmetry. So obviously we've got a bobcat in the bottom, and I'll look at both the canine tracks, the red fox and the coyote here up on the top. I'm hoping you can see my cursor here, but the canids have a distinct X. You can see it. If you almost squint at it, it comes out better. But there's a distinct X in the interstitial spaces between their pads. And you can see it even here in this fuzzy fox print, which is worth noting. Fox prints are often fuzzy because of very furry feet. But you can see that distinct X. And once you've trained your eyes on that, that X will stand out to you, and you'll know that you're at least dealing with a canid, a gray fox, a red fox, or a coyote. If you look at the bobcat, you can't connect an X through that. The pad is, the palm pad extends its way up into that space such that you can't draw a straight line through without crossing that pad. And once you've seen that, it becomes readily observable to you. And the other thing about the feline tracks is that they are almost like they're squished off to the side. The canine tracks are very symmetrical. So if you draw a line across the tip of their front toes and another line across these toes, they're parallel and they're perpendicular to the line of travel. Whereas if you do that with a bobcat, you can see that they are sloped quite notably, and they're even off skew of the line of travel in this direction as well. That's very distinctive. One thing to be aware of is that, particularly in mud, which I know this is winter tracking, but just a note out there, when canines are walking in mud, funny things happen. And sometimes their pads and things squish around, and you can easily mistake a canine track for a bobcat track, especially if the toenails didn't register. So their gait is a very smooth walking gait, and this is their standard gait here. Canada lynx on the left, bobcat on the right, same gait. Obviously very different tracks, very different animals, but their gait is a direct register. So they move the front foot on one side, and then the back foot on the other side, and then the back foot on the first side, and then the front foot on the second side. That's a really confusing way of saying it. But essentially, they move front first on one side, back second on the other side, and then they do the exact opposite with the two remaining legs. And they direct register. So the hind footprints directly lie on top of the front footprints when they're walking or even trotting. So what you're seeing here is both a front and a hind track, the hind being the last to be set. Looking at the canines, same thing. This is their walk pattern. This is the most common pattern you're going to see. One thing worth noting is that the red fox leaves an almost straight line of tracks. That's on the left here. That's the red fox. And you can see they line right up very nicely. And that's pretty indicative of a red fox, whereas the coyote, there's a zigzag to it. The gray fox as well, which is a much smaller stride than the coyote, certainly, and even a little smaller than the red fox, but it has a wider straddle. That's the width from side to side of the overall track. So a straddle measurement would be from a line drawn here to the line drawn there across, if that makes any sense. And there are variations, and I will say this, what makes this such a challenging group is because there are so many variations. And unless you have really good tracking conditions and get a good print, a good detailed print, it's hard. But some of the more common variations, and again, they all do this to some degree, is this lope here on the left. And it actually looks a lot like that Fisher track, the Fisher lope, if you recall, the direct four in a line, in the diagonal line. And that's a slow lope, but as they start speeding up to a trot or even a gallop, that all comes apart, and their hind feet start to move forward. That's right. So their hind feet, I get confused when I'm looking at it, but their hind feet start to move forward of their front feet with increasing speed in this lope to trot to gallop. And it leaves this more of a pattern like this here. And one note here about domestic dogs, and to be honest with you, I don't think this is a domestic dog track, but it actually, it made the point very well regardless, is that domestic dog tracks don't double register in their walking stride. They don't double register as well as the wild canids. And so when you see a pattern that looks like this, which is a walking pattern, it's just not double, it's more double registering than directly registering. That's typical of a domestic dog, as well as just the loopiness of a domestic dog track. They go over hill and dale, and there's usually human tracks associated with them. So I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention these iconic walkers, the white-tailed deer and the moose. They're very recognizable tracks to pretty much everybody out there. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I will just note that in the winter, which is what we're talking about here, these species both congregate in areas, and they will track up an area such that you cannot discern any particular pattern. It's just all prints everywhere. And, but fortunately, they're pretty easy to tell what they are because they leave very distinguished tracks. And they also leave distinguished behavior signs. So, deer beds are readily found in deer wintering areas, which is a habitat that looks much like this here, typically softwood, southwest facing slopes with a good solid canopy of hemlock preferred, but other softwood species as well. And you'll see these trails. Deer will walk on the same trail time and time again, in part because it packs the snow down. Now, the snow depth in this picture is not great, but they're just creatures of habit. They've been walking this path all winter when the snow depths were such that they needed to stay on the path. And of course, moose leave very discernible sign from raking their antlers up and down on balsam fir to bark scarring, red maple, striped maple trees like that. They leave kind of a pretty obvious like flags in the forest when you're walking through. You see them from quite a ways off. So getting back to the walkers, and I just wanted to note a couple behavior things to look for. Again, just as a small sampling of the great diversity of behaviors that this group has, but walking on logs, walking on high points, that all should lead to some clues of what is doing it. Bobcats are notorious log walkers. Walking on trails, that's definitely a coyote trait. And again, you'll find bobcat and foxes on trails as well, but if you're trying to discern one from the other and it looks like this and it doesn't leave you a good track pattern to look at, good bet that it's probably a coyote moving through. They love trails. And also multiple animals moving together like this would be indicative of coyotes, at least in my mind. You do see coyotes moving in pairs, triplets even more sometimes, whereas the others are typically by themselves. And the canines in general scent mark all over the place. So if you're following a pattern, you're trying to discern whether it's a bobcat or a canine, and you find a lot of scent marking. Bobcats also scent mark, but canines seem to do it prolifically. And a note about habitat for this group, the walkers. Again, it's as diverse as you can imagine, but when you're trying to narrow it down to find a particular species, if that's your goal, I want to find a bobcat track. Well, know something about the bobcat. What do they do? And this picture here on the left is results from a radio collar study that we did a number of years ago. And every dot represents a location of a bobcat in the Champlain Valley. And you can see this long line here was a railroad corridor that cat used as a linkage habitat to get around in its home range. But also you can see these little lines here represent are all either hedgerows between ag field, or stream corridors. Bobcats, we learned from this study, really focus on stream corridors as far as movement. So that's a good place to go. Ledges, if you can find porcupines there, there's a good chance you're going to find bobcat up in the ledges as well. They seem to have an affinity for ledges. They often den in ledges this time of year. And then really the shrub habitats, they have a high affinity for that. They love to get into those habitats where there's lots of cottontail rabbits, lots of other small mammals, or even in early successional stands, as we talked about earlier, the younger forest where you have lots of snowshoe hare, squirrels. That's where you're going to find the bobcats. But to be clear, you can find them anywhere in the state. They are all over. They use every habitat imaginable. And similarly, coyotes are probably the preeminent habitat generalist. They can be found everywhere in Vermont, every type of habitat, which is why I'm simply showing an aerial photo captured from some random spot in the state, because you can find a coyote anywhere. But red fox and gray fox, a little bit more nuanced. I mean, you can find them anywhere as well, but the red fox tend to be more focused on edge habitats. So they really like that area where the forest meets the field or the forest meets the wetland habitat. They actually will use some of the fields for mousing, particularly fallow fields, wetland habitats that they can go small mammal searching in. They tend to focus on those. So you'll find the red fox more associated with these edge habitats, whereas the gray fox tend to be more in the deep woods. Again, you can find them anywhere, but this is where you're more likely to see a gray fox, up in the hills, the hardwood forest primarily. So moving on to the last piece here is, where do you start? And I assume with the numbers of people that have tuned in today that a lot of you are probably already accomplished trackers. And I hope that the information I provided has just added to the arsenal that you have. But from this point forward, I just really wanted to get people tuned into where to go to find these habitats and where to engage with wildlife, again, to build a desire for stewardship and conservation of our wildlife and our land resources. And so here in Vermont, we are blessed. There's literally close to 25% of the state that has been conserved in some form or fashion, which is really impressive. A lot of hats off to a lot of organizations for making that happen. And why is that important? Well, it's important because whether you spend time in a conserved land or not, it benefits you because it's open space, it's habitat that animals live and breed in, and then they multiply and go forth to other areas in the state where we exist and where we can enjoy them and see them. But these lands, are actively managed. Sometimes in the case of wildlife management areas, they're actively managed for wildlife being the principal goal for our WMAs, wildlife management areas. These are Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department owned lands. And there are, oddly enough, last year, 2020, we acquired our 100th wildlife management area. And it was 100 years exactly since the first wildlife management area, Sandbar Wildlife Management Area, was acquired. So it was a big celebration for us, 130,000 acres of land spread out over the entire state. And notably, it encompasses a lot of really key diverse habitats. So it gives you an idea of places to go. This is public land. Access in the winter can sometimes be a challenge, but if you're willing to park on the side of a road or find a little pull-off, and we do maintain access points as well on a lot of these, there's a lot of habitat to explore. So how do you figure out where to go, what WMA to choose? Go to our website, listed up here at the top, click on land and habitat or lands and habitat. A drop-down list appears over here. You click on state lands, state managed lands, and then you get this menu here. And there's two ways to access WMAs here. You can click on the wildlife management areas, and that will bring you to what we call a district map. So the state has 5 districts, and there's a map so you can figure out which district you're in. And under each district is a list, an alphabetical list of all the WMAs. And if you click on the WMA of interest, you're returned with this format of information. So this gives you all the tidbits that you need: habitat features, species known to exist there. This helps you plan an outing. Maybe I should get up to that particular place. Let's look at this, see if this works. Oh yeah, and then you can look at the map and there's the habitat. There's the wetland that you want to go explore. Or there's the softwood ridge up here. You get the point. The other way of doing it is click the second button, which is an interactive map. And it's notable that this is a work in progress. This is relatively new for us, and it will be morphing in the future and improving, but it's still an excellent tool as is for you to select from a drop-down list of all the WMAs. You click on it and the map automatically orients to that property. And then you can actually see an aerial photo, which helps you, again, determine some of the habitat features that may be present and how to find them, like the parking area here and so on and so forth. So that is, I think, it for me. Yeah. So Peter, you're up.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. So what we're looking at here is VLT's recreation page. So if you go to our website shown there at the top, this is what you'll see. All those little green flags are areas where there's a public access of some sort. And if you click on one of them, it's sort of similar to what you found in the WMA finder there. So my goal here is to just quickly highlight 3 of them that are in slightly different places from what Chris was talking about. So let's start here down in Bennington. If you can go to the next slide, Chris. This is the Greenberg Headwaters Park. It's just outside of Bennington proper. And when you click on that little green flag for this one, again, just like at the WMA finder, there's a map on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, there's some information about the property, the habitat, when it was conserved, and where to park, and trails and that sort of thing. If we go to the next slide, we can look at some of the habitats that can be found here. There's a lot of trails, a lot of water. So there are trails that go through upland wooded habitats. There are some that go along the Walloomsac River, and then some that come out into more open, sort of shrubby, brushy habitats. So there's a potential to see a lot of different kinds of animals on this particular property. So for those of you in the southern part of the state, this might be a nice one to check out. And the next one we're going to look at is more in the central part of the state. This is actually in Marshfield, the Stranahan Forest. It's a town-owned forest. And as you can see from this map, all the different colored little squiggles there are trails. There are trails that go through hardwood stands. There are trails that go through softwood stands. You'll probably encounter a lot of deer in some of those softwood stands. There's also trails that go around wetlands, and there's an old class 4 road that goes right up through some open areas and some brushy habitat. There are places to park up there, so that's a nice one. That's a fairly big property. You can spend a lot of time and see a lot of different habitats on that one. And the last one we're going to look at is in the northwest part of the state. This is one that we conserved just a couple of years ago. It's kind of a neat little property. It's the Georgetown Forest, and it's got a beaver flowage. So you may find things like maybe there's a beaver popping up out of there, or otters poking around. There's some talus slopes like Chris was talking about. You might find something denning in those or walking around in those talus slopes, and some streams coming through. And like Chris just mentioned, that's a great place to look, because streams are often great travel corridors for wildlife. So that's just 3. If we go to the next slide, that's just 3 of those properties. There's hundreds of them around the state. So go check out our rec page, find something near you, and go out and explore a little bit. Let us know what you find. And with that, I'll turn it over to Catherine.
You're muted, Catherine.
Oh my God. Okay, sorry everyone.
I'm glad that's not just me.
Yeah, I'm like, that shouldn't be happening to me at this point in my career of Zoom. Sorry that we're a couple minutes past, but I do first and foremost want to thank Chris and Peter, and also to anyone who might have experienced issues logging on. So sorry about that, and thank you for like hanging in there and being persistent and contacting me to get logged in. We identified the problem. So definitely, we're always learning to make the next webinar better. So thanks for being here and supporting us still. We have a couple. Oh yes, this event is going to be recorded, and we will put it on our YouTube page probably by tomorrow afternoon. So check that out. You'll get an email with a survey, which we really appreciate seeing the feedback from. So keep an eye on that. We have some upcoming events. March 25th, we have Abenaki Sugaring and Stories with Chief Don Stevens, and that's going to be really cool. And then on April 8th, Coyotes, Foxes, and Fishers Wildlife in the city of Burlington. So if you're tuning in from that area, that'll probably be really cool for you. And there's always one more thing I say, but now I can't remember it. But we will probably hang on for about 10 more minutes to answer some questions. So you can put those in the Q&A now, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But again, thanks for hanging on, even with the technical issues. We really appreciate the support. So Q&A time, Chris and Peter?
Great,
right.
Thank you. So one other thing is that we'll probably be sending you a follow-up email with a survey to, again, help us sort of triage how this went and plan for the next one, get your feedback. We'd like to hear any feedback that you have. And in that follow-up email, we'll provide some of the resources that Chris was talking about in his presentation. And if we don't have time to cover all the questions that we've got here today, we'll answer some of those as well. So have a look for that in your inbox. I just noticed that Charlie Sincerbo had his hand up. I'm not sure how we deal with that, Catherine. He can't actually speak, right? And it looks like Mary just raised her hand. So maybe they could, oh, Charlie just typed his question into the Q&A. So maybe we can have that. So Chris, a couple of questions. Rick says when he was tracking this winter, he was confronted with a quandary. Should he always stay on established trails, or is it okay to follow the tracks of the trail wherever they go?
Great question. So it's worth being cautious in that regard. We leave the trail, but I personally am an advocate for leaving the trail and following the tracks. You can follow them in reverse. So you're going where the animal was. So you're the opposite direction the animal was going. That's fine. If it's a bear track that you're following, you probably want to do that. Don't follow it forward. But if you're following a porcupine track, yeah, I follow the porcupine track and try to find a porcupine. That's the fun of it. And there's no harm in doing that. I mean, you don't want to, disturb the porcupine if you're lucky to find it. But often, the story unfolds as you leave the trail that you're on and follow the track. And I find it to be an important part of becoming a proficient tracker and being able to identify things. You just have to be sensible with it and not get to a point where you're catching up with an animal that may be dangerous or where you may be making it uncomfortable. If you're in a deer yard, for example, in the winter, you want to be careful. You don't want to be pushing deer all over the place. They're stressed already, and they're going to flee from you. And in the act of fleeing, they're burning up incredible resources that they need to survive the winter. So you have to think things through in how you engage it. But you can follow tracks off trail and really have a good, productive time. And never, 9 times out of 10, you never see the animal. You never catch up with it. The animal may have passed through hours before, if not days, and you'll never catch up with it. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. And he's got another question. He says in one of the first slides of photos, he saw a track he saw last week. It's a parallel track, like a rail track, but with a deeper penetration of the snow on the right side and a shallower penetration of snow on the left. Any idea what it is or why that's happening?
Well, one of the things could be just the consistency of the snow. I mean, it's really hard for me to give you clues as to what it is without being there and seeing it and looking at behavior, habitat, and all the stuff. That being said, when you have any sort of crust, whether it's the surface or even midway through the snowpack, that does make a difference how animals' tracks register. Well, register as well as present themselves. And it sounds like maybe that was the case. One foot just broke through further than the other one. And maybe that was consistent. Maybe that animal, for some reason, had a little more of a consistent lean on one side. It sounds like they were kind of together like this, one next to the other is the way I pictured the description. And again, that would put it in my mind potentially in the bounders. It could also be in the walkers that are moving up toward that trot or gallop where they're losing that straight line walk gait, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and one thing that I learned when we did this, learned from you last year when we did this, and you just reminded me of, is that it's really hard to distinguish these things if you come across one or you looking at it in one particular area. But if you follow that track and you go one direction or the other and look at its behavior, and also those tracks are going to change as the animal moves along, and at some point you're probably going to find that track that makes you say, that's what it is. So right. that was an epiphany for me last year when we did this.
In that same manner, they pass through different microclimates where the snow consistency is different, whether they pass underneath the boughs of a fir tree and they leave a different type of track or just a clear track. Or if they step on a rock, you know what I mean, snow covered, and they get a more of a firm print made there. So if you follow the track long enough, eventually sometimes they leave a print that gives you the details you need to figure out what it is.
So Charlie would like to know how many toes are typically distinguishable in a bear's footprint, and wonders if you could go back to the page with a photo of that.
I can. So it's 5. They're plantigrade, walking on their heels. And it's quite a ways back, bear with me. But yeah, they leave a very distinct 5-toed track. I mean, with any of these, come on, with any of these, you're gonna find variation. Oops, I passed it, sorry, oh darn it. My apologies, I got over ambitious with my, where are you? Right here. There we go. There you go. So I think it's most visible right here. There's 1 toe, 3, 4, wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There you go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. this looks to be like a direct register, although I can't, no, that might be just a clean double register, single print, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Great, thanks. And Dana has a question. Looking at deep impressions in deep snow, so more of a body impression, I think, than a foot. Mentions seeing rectangles in the snow, the large, narrow rectangles, maybe 9 to 12 inches wide, 2.5 feet long. Made a path to a tree on a diagonal was what they knew was a gray squirrel track that converged at the tree. It looked like maybe a red fox pursuing a squirrel, and the squirrel made it to the tree. But it was the first time that particular pattern had been encountered. You have thoughts on that one?
Again, really challenge to armchair the situation there without being there to look at it. But as you were talking, it almost sounded to me like it would have been a longer legged animal. I don't know how deep the snow was, but like a deer, for instance, that's kind of plowing through snow, and the snow consistency being such, sometimes it plants its foot, and it leans forward. And it actually slices, like what you described, like a rectangle triangle in the snow. If that makes sense. And then it lifts out and goes to the next. I've seen that. Fox could do that, certainly. I think that's what the questioner was suggesting, that it might have been a fox.
Yeah.
And I will say again, in deep snow, it becomes a real challenge. And so then you end up having to lean on the behaviors and the habitat to start eliminating things. And if you have the time, follow the track. Eventually it'll find its way back into the woods. Maybe there's, again, a microclimate where it belies a better pattern. But it's hard to say for certain what that was. It could have been a fox. I certainly have seen fox leaving like a long, almost trough-like, where they're dragging. Coyotes do that as well.
Sally wants to know what the home range of a bobcat is.
Oh boy. So it varies depending on their where they are in the quality of the habitat in the area that they are in. So if you have a cat that is more of like a forest, its home range is solely in like a forested habitat, it's likely going to be a little bit bigger, perhaps, to get the same amount of resources as an animal that's spanning kind of more of a richer environment, if you will, a more diverse environment where it has a higher access to prey. So it's quite a range, but I want to say, I think in terms of square kilometers versus acres. So it's a challenge, but I'm going to say in the ballpark of like 20 square kilometers to like 60 square kilometers. What's that equate to acres? Anyone quick with their math? Write it down and Google that. It's a big area. Bobcats have a large area, and that slide that shows all the yellow dots is exactly getting at that. We measured home ranges that was all Champlain Valley. Some of the cats ended up having home ranges further upslope and had, like I said, a little bit higher or larger home ranges. And also the sexes differ too. So a male is going to have a little bit bigger home range than a female. But I think if I remember correctly, it's like 20 square kilometers on the small end to like maybe even 80 square kilometers, I think, on the top end.
So we're getting pretty close to the end here. Maybe we can take one more and then we'll answer the rest in our follow-up email. I'm sorry, we can't quite get to all of them. So a couple people asked the question of how the bounders make the groups of 3 or 4 prints. What's happening there?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mishmash. They've lost, or they have abandoned their trademark bound at that point. And so it's more of a walking pattern. So there's a bit of double registering going on, which again is like single prints. I don't know why it's called double registering. It's always been confusing to me, but the prints are individual. And then there's also a mix of direct registering where one print is on top of the other. And so it's all about the speed at which the animal is going and how it unfolds. And so that diagonal line of 4 followed by the diagonal line of 4 is a slow lope. And that's all 4 tracks, all 4 feet registering. I don't know if the sound effect helps. It does in my mind. That's the artistic part of tracking,
right?
The sound to it. But then they start going a little faster, and it's more like, they're just getting going. As far as like which foot comes first and after, that's quite a study. I will say that Paul Rosenda's book that I referenced early on, I think does a really good job of describing just that, of how to interpret a pattern, front and back feet, and how those change through the various speeds an animal is moving and through the various gaits. It's a great resource in that respect.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I think that's a great place to stop. And we will, again, I'll remind you that we will be sending out a follow-up email with those resources that Chris mentioned. So if you want to go out and pick some of those up for your next trip out into the woods, you can do that. We'll also have links to the wildlife management area finder page and the BLT rec page, and we'll answer the rest of your questions. So thanks so much for spending some time with us today, and
I'll say,
a beautiful day.
I say there's still some time to get outside. It's only
that's right.
past 2, so get out there. Enjoy.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.